The framework behind the evolutionist worldview is naturalism. It's assumed that things made themselves, that no divine intervention ever happened, and that God hasn't revealed knowledge about the past to us. Should we consider naturalism science, or maybe just a judgment that should be considered something else? Coming up next, evolution, science or religion, with Dr. Terry Mortenson. Hello, my friends. Welcome to Origins. My name is Donn Chapman. It's my privilege to be your host. You know, Origins is a forum where we take the evidence of science and we use it to validate the truth of God's creation. Today we have with us Dr. Terry Mortenson. And Dr. Mortenson has his PhD from the University of Coventry in England, where he studied the history of geology. And I think that's an amazing background to come to be with us today. He's been on the staff of Answers in Genesis as a speaker since 2001. We're so honored to have you with us today, sir.
Good to be with you, Don.
Now, today we're going to talk about evolution, and we're going to talk about operation science and origin science. When we start talking about evolution and creation, here's the mantra that I always get from the other side. Well, you know, creation, that's religion, and evolution, that's science. How do you answer that?
Well, my answer to that is you've got a fuzzy definition of science, and you're not defining things carefully. When we really look at it, they're both similar.
You know, when I deal with evolutionists, it's this changing of definition of words that makes it hard to talk. Is that true?
That's exactly right. And I think there's two broad categories of science that we need to understand to be able to understand this origins controversy. That would be operation science and origin science. Let's define these terms so that we can have a rational discussion here. And the scientific method is what we normally think of, and that is the use of observable, repeatable experiments in a controlled environment, that's usually in a laboratory, to understand how things operate or function in the present so that we can find cures for disease or develop new technologies. And so we sometimes call that also experimental science. So most of biology, chemistry, physics, medical research, engineering research, that's all in the area of operation science. How do things operate so that we can manipulate them?
We take a theory, we test it, it's repeatable, it does the same thing every time, so we know it's a fact.
That's right.
Okay.
Right.
Okay.
But in contrast, that kind of science is not going to answer the question how the Grand Canyon formed.
No.
Because you can't recreate it in the laboratory. It's a historical question. It happened in the past. Nobody was standing there to watch it, and so we got to try to figure out what happened in the past. It also, operation science won't answer the question, is the body buried under the slab in the floor of Westminster Abbey Charles Darwin? You can't raise him from the dead and ask him. So it's a historical question, and for that, we need origin science.
Now, what is origin science?
Okay, well, I would describe origin science as using the legal historical method, which can be defined this way. The use of reliable eyewitness testimony, if any is available, and observable evidence to determine the past unobservable, unrepeatable event or events which produced the observable evidence we see in the present. So if I'm standing at the north rim of the Grand Canyon and I'm looking at the canyon, I want to know what happened in the past to produce those rock layers a mile deep and cause that huge hole in the ground. It's a historical question. And so I'm looking at the evidence in the present to reconstruct the unobserved past.
Okay, that makes sense.
And so we also call this historical science. And so much of geology, paleontology, archaeology, cosmogony, the attempt to reconstruct the history of the universe, and criminal investigation. Those are all historical or origin sciences. They're trying to reconstruct the unobserved past.
Now, it seems to me that the degree of certainty between these two kinds of science is very different.
It is very different because our assumptions about the past and about the present affect our interpretation of the evidence as we seek to reconstruct the past.
We all have a human nature, so what we assume, we naturally will look for evidence to validate that.
That's right. And so no scientist goes out into the world with an empty mind.
No.
He has certain assumptions.
We all wear glasses.
Right, worldview assumptions.
Lenses,
and those will affect what we see and how we interpret and reconstruct the past. They influence or control the questions we ask. An evolutionary geologist going into the Grand Canyon will never ask the question, could Noah's flood have caused what I'm looking at?
No,
It's not even on his radar.
Right.
But a creation scientist is taking the eyewitness testimony of God in the Bible about that event, and he's asking that question. Can what I see be explained by Noah's flood?
So the evolutionist is probably thinking, how many billions of years did it take to make this hole?
Exactly.
And the creationist is saying, what here would validate the flood?
That's right. That's right. Second, they influence what we see in our research. No scientist goes into the Grand Canyon. He can't actually consciously look at everything he sees. There's some things that just go right by him.
Sure.
Okay, and the assumptions will influence a person and what they see. They influence what data we collect. You can't write down everything you observe. You're mentally making decisions. Oh, that's important. I need to write that down. Oh, that's not important. I don't need to write that down. And then the assumptions also influence or control our interpretations when we get back to our study and try to put together our notes and try to understand things. So those assumptions are really critical, and every scientist has assumptions.
Creationists do just as much as evolutionists. We're not just picking on the other side. Both sides have assumptions.
That's right. But here's the problem, Donn.
All right.
Most evolutionists aren't aware of their assumptions and don't acknowledge them.
That's right.
The creationists are right up front about our assumptions.
Okay.
So let's look at, and you hinted at this before, that those assumptions are kind of like glasses. Mm-hmm. And the evolutionist is using just his own human reason. He's denying the eyewitness testimony of the Creator, whereas the creationist is using God's Word, his eyewitness testimony about history, to understand the world. And so they put on those glasses, and they look at the world, and they try to reinterpret the world and to reconstruct that past based on those assumptions. So let's start by looking at some of the assumptions of the evolutionists. The first assumption is that nature is all that exists. Now, not every scientist believes that. There are people who believe in God, but most scientists do their work as if nature is all that exists. So if God exists, he's not on the radar. He doesn't come into the picture in terms of reconstructing the past.
In fact, back to our first point where we talked about creation is religion and science, evolution is science, they've really made a box where God isn't allowed in, haven't they?
Right, and that's a religious assumption.
Yes.
Secondly, they assume that everything can and indeed must be explained by three things: time and chance and the laws of nature working on matter. So if you have enough time, millions and millions of years, chance and the laws of nature, you can explain the origin of the Grand Canyon, the origin of the fossils, the origin of the creatures that became fossils. You can explain the origin of the solar system and galaxies and man.
And if the explanation doesn't work, you just add a little more time.
That's right. That's right. And those assumptions are really the religion of atheism.
Yes, sir.
Or the philosophy of naturalism.
Uh-huh.
And those assumptions control virtually all of science today.
When you say it controls all of science, it doesn't control you and it doesn't control me. But if you're talking about the institutions of our country, the universities, the schools, the science
journals,
research, the giving of grants, all of that works from this assumption.
Right. This is the world
They have a monopoly.
controlling science.
Yes.
That's right. That's
Okay.
right. Let me just give you a quote by a leading evolutionist that brings this real clear. Our willingness to accept scientific claims that are against common sense is the key to understanding the real struggle between science and the supernatural. See, even the way he's used the word science, he's
Yes.
already made it naturalistic.
That's right.
Okay? We take the side of science in spite of the patent absurdities of some of its constructs.
That's amazing.
In spite of its failure to fulfill many of its extravagant promises of health and life. In spite of the tolerance of the scientific community for unsubstantiated just-so stories like dinosaurs evolving into birds or monkeys evolving into people. Because we have an a priori commitment, a commitment to materialism. And he says, it is not that the methods and institutions of science somehow compel us to accept a material explanation of the phenomenal world, but on the contrary, that we are forced by our a priori adherence to material causes to create an apparatus of investigation and a set of concepts that produce material explanations, no matter how mystifying to the uninitiated. Moreover, that materialism is absolute, for we cannot allow a divine foot in the door.
Boy, that's an amazing quote. He says he realizes what they're saying is absurd, it's illogical, it's impossible, but we're still going to stick with it anyhow.
Yeah, we cannot allow a God into our
We would rather
reconstructed.
believe the absurd than open the door for the possibility of God.
Right. And so that is a religious view.
And that is not science.
No, that is philosophy masquerading as science.
Absolutely.
So out of that kind of thinking comes the evolution tree of life. The different branches represent all the different plants and animals, and the evolutionists say all of those different plants and animals are related to a common ancestor, the first microscopic bacterium that popped into existence by chance on an Earth that formed by chance, in a solar system that formed by chance over millions and millions of years. So it flows right out of that naturalistic, atheistic worldview.
Okay, that's the evolutionary assumption. What about the creationist assumption? What are our glasses?
Oh, I like to call this the microbe to microbiologist theory for the origin of life, or from goo to you via the zoo.
Yeah.
Okay, let's look at the creationist. He doesn't start with those naturalistic assumptions. He has a different starting point. And the first one is that the eternal, good, all-knowing, all-powerful, holy God exists, and He created everything else. Nature is not all there is.
In the beginning, God.
That's right. Nature is not all there is.
No, that's right.
Second assumption is that God's perfect word, the Bible, is the eyewitness testimony that enables us to correctly interpret the observable evidence to understand the origin and history of the creation. Now, my son's a sheriff's deputy. If he finds a dead body in the living room of a house, he has to try to reconstruct what happened in the past to produce that. And if he's a good cop, he's going to go talk to the neighbors and see if there are any eyewitnesses to help him understand the evidence that he's looking at.
And God's Word does that for us.
And God's Word is that eyewitness testimony.
Yeah.
And so in terms of the origin of living things, in Genesis 1, God says that He created the first plants and animals and sea creatures and birds after their kind. That phrase appears 10 times in Genesis 1. And so God is saying He made distinct kinds to reproduce after their kind. He said the same thing on day 6, the land animals. And so He created mankind. But He didn't create all of those people on day 6. He created Adam and Eve. And in the genetic code of Adam and Eve was all the information for producing all that variety of skin color and eye color and hair color. That's all mankind. We're all one race descended from Adam. God created the cat kind. He didn't create each of those cats on day 6. He created the cat kind with the genetic potential in the DNA to produce that variety. Or the elephant kind, or the horse kind. He didn't create each one of those. So God built in variation into the kinds, but not the ability to change from one kind into another.
So the modern scientific word for kind would be?
Well, creation scientists have been studying that question. It's very clear that except for Homo sapiens, man, it's not at the species level. Okay. In most cases, it's not at the genus level of scientific classification. It's probably at the family level with plants. In some cases, it might even be at the level of order. So God built a lot of genetic variation within the kind, but not the ability to change from one kind into another, okay, which is what evolution is saying.
That's a really good answer.
So I like to call it, in contrast to the evolution tree of life, the creation forest of life. Each tree is a different kind of plant or animal, And God built into those original kinds that He created supernaturally the genetic information in the DNA to produce variety within their kind, but not the ability to change into a different kind. And so they produced variety up to the flood, 1,600 years later. And then after the flood, creatures could produce variety within their kind. But one tree doesn't change into a different tree. Each kind stays distinct, only producing variety within its kind. So you have the evolution tree of life where everything is descended from a common ancestor, and the creation forest of life where they're distinct.
All right,
Kinds.
Dr. Mortenson, we have to take a break. When we come back, we want to see the implications of this and what this means to us as God's people resting on God's Word. Don't you go away. This is very important, and we'll be right back.
Today's guest on Origins, Dr. Terry Mortenson, has a PhD in the history of geology and has lectured on the creation-evolution controversy in 21 countries since the 1970s. He's also author of several books including The Great Turning Point. You'll definitely want this for your personal library. Book orders are being taken at 1-800-778-3390. Dr. Mortenson is a speaker, researcher, and writer for Answers in Genesis. For more information, write to Answers in Genesis, P.O. Box 510, Hebron, Kentucky 41048, or visit the website at www.answersingenesis.org.
We're back with Dr. Terry Mortenson, and we're talking about experimental science versus origin science and the difference. Dr. Mortenson, would you kind of sum up for us what we've learned so far?
Yeah. We talked about the fact that there are two broad categories of science. There's the science that we do in the laboratory to find cures for disease or new technologies. And then there's the science that we use to look at the earth and try to reconstruct the unobserved past. And so it's really important for people to understand those differences and to understand the role of assumptions in science, especially in origin science. So for example, everybody, all the scientists, whether they're evolutionists or creationists, they all have the same facts, the same rock layers and fossils. They all go to the Grand Canyon, they see the very same layers and fossils. But what they believe going into the canyon before they ever look at anything, their assumptions will affect what they see and how they interpret what they see as they seek to reconstruct that unobserved past. And so if they start with naturalistic assumptions that everything is the result of time and chance and the laws of nature, and it's millions of years, then they'll look at those erosional features and they'll say it had to take millions of years to carve the canyon and millions of years to lay down the layers. And so they come up with the idea of an old earth and no global flood. A creationist will go into the very same canyon looking at the very same rocks, but he starts with biblical assumptions, and that is that the God of the whole creation has spoken through His words. He's told us about a historical event called Noah's flood that was a catastrophic global year-long flood. And He's going to look at those rocks and say, is there any evidence in those rocks? And He sees all kinds of evidence. So the issue is not really the rocks and the fossils. The issue is what are the starting assumptions that we're using to interpret what we see. Now, I want to focus on just a concrete example of one assumption that controls evolutionary thinking today. And it's a false assumption. The absence of fossils of a creature in a particular geological formation is evidence of the non-existence of that creature when that sedimentary layer was deposited. So let me illustrate. People will see a diagram like this in the school textbooks, in science museums, natural history museums, And it shows the evolutionary view of the history of life, starting with simple bottom-dwelling sea creatures up through fish and amphibians, reptiles, eventually mammals and people. And they say, well, different creatures lived at different times because we don't find the fossils, for example, of dinosaurs way down here at the bottom. Or a real popular one, you know, we don't find any human fossils with dinosaur bones, so that's proof positive that dinosaurs and people never lived together.
Why doesn't that make sense?
Well, it doesn't make sense because the idea that the absence of fossil evidence in a rock layer is not proof that the creature didn't live at that time. And I want to illustrate. With the dinosaurs, they say the dinosaurs went extinct about 65 million years ago because as they come up through the rock layers, the highest rock layer where they find dinosaur bones, they date at 65 million. Above that, no dinosaur bones and no humans. Of course, we have humans today, and we all know, of course, we all believe that no living dinosaurs exist. So there's your proof. But I want to give you a couple of examples to prove that that assumption is false. There's a fish in the fossil record called the coelacanth. It was only found in the rock layers, the highest rock layer that the dinosaurs went extinct with. So they said, well, the coelacanth went extinct with the dinosaurs. Because above those layers, no coelacanth fossils. They said that until 1938 when they found the coelacanth swimming off the coast of Madagascar. And when they compared the living fish to the fossil, it was virtually identical.
He hasn't changed.
It hasn't changed in supposedly
He hasn't
65
evolved,
million
yeah.
years. But nobody believes it re-evolved into existence after being extinct.
It's been around.
It's been around, but there's no fossil evidence that it was. Another example is the Wallamai pine. It's a tree that was only known from the fossil record, thought to have gone extinct 150 million years ago, rediscovered living in 1994. And when they compared the living tree with the fossil, it was virtually identical. Again, no fossil change.
So what we're saying is that really fossil record is anecdotal evidence in the fact that it's one space in time in one place, and that doesn't mean everything that was on the earth was at that place at that time.
I can give you another example the other way. Here we have a picture of a fossil from a rock layer supposedly 190 million years old. Looks exactly like a living horseshoe crab today. And originally, the evolutionists said it evolved into existence about 345 million years ago because that was the lowest rock layer where they found it. And then just recently, they found it in rocks that they say are 445 million years old. So then they have to change their theory. Oh, it actually evolved into existence much earlier than we previously thought. Well, some evolutionists do understand this issue. Ernst Mayr was the greatest living evolutionist of the 20th century, professor at Harvard University. And he said the fossil record of the earliest plants is very poor. Fossils of mosses, generally considered the most primitive of the living land plants, have been around from the Devonian period, but surely they existed earlier but did not fossilize. So he's saying the earliest mosses are found in the Devonian, but they had to have evolved before that. And so he says, even though we don't have any fossil mosses down lower, they had to have evolved then because the theory of evolution requires it. Yeah. Now, if I came to Dr. Mayr and I said, listen, not only were the mosses down there, so were humans. Oh, no, there's no fossil evidence of humans down there. He's just using the absence of evidence when it supports his view and ignoring it when it doesn't. Those glasses influence the way we look at the world. And most scientists are wearing what we call evolutionized glasses with those naturalistic assumptions. Nature is all there is, everything explained by time and chance and the laws of nature. But Christians need to put on biblical glasses, the eyewitness testimony of the Creator who was there all the way through the past. He was there at the beginning. He knows everything. He always tells the truth. The scientists weren't there. They don't know everything. And so evolution is an origin science account based on atheistic assumptions about the unobserved past. Creation is an origin science account based on the biblical assumptions taken from the eyewitness historical record of the Creator.
Two very different ways of looking at the same evidence. You know, my friends, I hope that you've been paying attention today because this show is so important. Because the culture that we live in, the scientific community within that culture, they want you to believe that they have it all nailed down. And they borrow authority from experimental science, where we can validate facts, and they apply it to origin science, where they are making assumptions that simply are not verifiable. We creationists acknowledge that we have assumptions too. We believe in a God who made the heaven and earth, and we believe that that God who made it has witnessed through His Word to what is there. And you can believe God's Word with us, because when you look at the evidence and you see God's handiwork, it proves God's Word true. So my friend, we have a great debt to pay to Dr. Mortenson and scientists like him who hold up a hand and say, wait a minute, look at it through these lenses and it'll all make sense. I just want to sum up what I say to you every week, and that is, when you look at the truth, it'll drive you back to God, His Word, and His truth. Because it's God's view He created you. That should be your worldview too. Hope to see you again here soon on Origins. Until then, God bless you, my friend.
Thank you for watching this edition of Origins. If you'd like a copy of the PowerPoint information presented today, you can download a PDF file from our website at www.originstv.org. Or for a DVD of this series, send a $12 donation to cover shipping and handling and write to Origins Program, number 1402, Cornerstone Television, Wall, Pennsylvania 15148.
Origins is made possible by the faithful prayers and financial support of you, our Cornerstone family.